Welcome to Don't Mind Me, I'm Different, the podcast where I kick down the barriers and myths surrounding ADHD in the workplace. Trust me, it's out there. Whether it's navigating the office chaos, or trying to break this stigma, or just learning what is this thing called ADHD, I'm here step by step to advocate, educate, and empower you in any way that I can. Get ready to own your difference and shine on your job. Oh man, this is episode 2 of Don't Mind Me, I'm Different, where we talk about how to organize your work with Jake Ruzi, who is a professional at supporting people working in education, figure out how to handle their workload in a more intentional and organized way so that they have more of a healthy work-life balance and they come home at the end of the day feeling like they've got everything they need to do accomplished. So at the end of the episode, he has the special tips and where he shares his secret sauce. And stay tuned to the very end because I have a special gift for you. And before we get going, just remember that I am not a professional. I'm just a guy with ADHD sharing his experience. Let's get it rocking. Oh, hey guys, this is Ron here for my interview with Jake Ruzi. Am I saying that right?
Yep.
Um, so yeah, and it's gonna be my first interview, so just please bear with me as
I'm
I
honored.
go through the growing pains. So Jake, so tell me a little bit about what you do and kind of maybe a little bit about your ADHD, like your connection to ADHD.
Yeah, so it's kind of a multifaceted answer in the sense of, professionally, what I do is I support people working in education, kind of figure out how to handle their workload a little bit more and kind of in a more intentional and organized way so that we can go home feeling like we got everything accomplished and kind of build that healthy life work balance where if working in education a lot of times it seems like everything is super critical, which a lot of times it is, but we just don't have enough time to, get all that stuff done. And my approach is kind of, well, regardless of how we feel about the time we all have the same amount of it. So how do we use it more effectively and in a way that makes a sense for us and our own abilities? Um, and then on the other side, in my personal life, my wife was recently diagnosed with ADHD and has been kind of going through a
Oh
journey with
wow.
that, trying to discover, what does that mean for her? But then also, like, one thing that I thought was kind of interesting when you asked me about the podcast was like I started chatting with her about what is the experience like in a relationship and kind of how does that work out with like, me as a partner being able to support her and kind of like us together figuring out what it means for her to have ADHD and how do we like run a household together in a way that makes sense and honors like her ADHD, but then also the way that it works for me and all that stuff. So it's been a kind of an interesting journey with that, and that's only been let's see, I'm thinking she got her diagnosis maybe 6 months ago, less than that.
Oh wow.
So it's still
Yeah.
still pretty fresh, but, I mean, I'm sure as you know, like, just because you have a diagnosis doesn't mean that you're like, "Oh, wow, now everything's fixed." Like, it just kinda gives you that frame of mind to be like, "Oh, that's why that's been happening," or "That's why that is like that," and so then for me, as the person on the kind of supporting side being like, "Oh yeah, that does make sense." And she, one thing when she came home and was like, "Well, it's official. Like I've officially have my diagnosis of ADHD. Like, does that surprise you?" It's like, "No, not at all." Like I definitely, for me, I wasn't thinking like, "Oh, like, you should go get diagnosed for ADHD and this stuff." But, like, now, like, kind of reflecting on it, like, no, it's not surprising that you have it because like, all these little quirks of just, like, seeing the way that
Yeah,
she operates in the world has just kind of made sense.
yeah. I'm sure she was like kind of like unveiling something and wanted you to be like wanted a different response, perhaps like like oh
Yeah.
no, this is no. Because almost like I know, like I'm the last person to find out that I have ADHD. I think the rest of the world has a problem, not me.
Yeah, well, and I would argue that both of those things can be true, like, I mean, I think about just in my work in a professional sense, like working in education, the world does have a problem. I'll tell you what, like just the way that we expect people to work and be productive just doesn't make sense. And adding in a layer of ADHD just makes it like 10 times worse. Of like, if you have expectations to do your work in a specific kind of way, then like that in itself can be a hindrance to like the quality of the work that you can produce. If you're expected to follow like a step-by-step instruction of how to do something, but that
Yeah,
step-by-step doesn't work for you, like I don't know if
yeah.
that resonates with your experience.
Oh yeah, and that's something that is going leads into my next question which would be do you see um how often do you see the differences in learning techniques from the educators that you talk to? Is that there, or is it is it needed more?
What do you mean by that?
So like say the different types of learning techniques, like from visual and audio to like more spatial. Like I need to be hands on and see it rather than be told about it, which is typical of schools, is like do this like you were talking about, step by step by step. And usually that doesn't work for me. That's I'm on the last step, then the middle step, then the first step. And that make more sense?
Yeah, yeah, thank you for clarifying that. I definitely think like just in general, thinking about like learning and how people learn as kind of that binary, like I'm a visual learner, I'm a hands-on learner, I'm an experiential learner, whatever you want to call it. Like I think that in
Yeah.
itself kind of like perpetuates some, you know, not best practices in my opinion of like, for example, I run in-person trainings for educators, and regardless of how you learn, if I get up there and I just stand in the front of the room and I talk to you, no one's gonna have a
Mhm.
good time with that. Like, across the board, I don't care if you're an auditory learner, like, you're still not gonna have a good time with that. And so I think, like, to answer your question, like, yes, there is a ton of variation in the way that people learn and the way that people can apply learnings, but I kinda see that there's not always an abundance of understanding of what to do with that. So,
Mm.
I think we get kind of stuck in a trap of thinking that, well, because we know that a lot of people learn different ways and kind of apply it different ways, we need to figure out how to do these extravagant like differentiation for how people learn. And I kind of think like on the one hand, if we can just get a really solid understanding of like what does it take for the quote unquote average person to learn, and then build from there, and then what does it take for like someone with ADHD to learn, and then like
Mhm.
incorporate that into your general like approach to learning, then we can benefit everybody that way. So I don't know if that kind of answers your question.
Yeah, yeah, in a way. It's more about, how often do you see that? Is that something like you were talking about that's coming up, or is it something that, is already happening a lot, or what's your general feel for that extravagant style of learning, of teaching, really?
Yeah, well, I think I should be clear that I'm not a teacher and I've never been a teacher. Um,
Hmm.
but the I think there is a lot of emphasis on trying to create a better environment for all kinds of learners. So that's certainly
Yeah,
like in the conversation of education as a whole, of like how do we start to understand what it takes for, a learner with ADHD to sit in a classroom, or not necessarily just sit in a classroom, but like have a quality educational experience that makes sense for them. And I think it's really hard because not a lot of people really know what that means. Or if they know what it means, they kind of execute it in a way that is not sustainable or doesn't really make sense.
yeah,
Because even like between people with ADHD, you can get a different style of learning just between individuals. So, in my work, mostly working with adults, everybody has their own style of learning and their own way that they're going to grapple with whatever content is in front of them. And I think that that makes it really difficult to try to figure out, how do I, as the presenter, like put this out into the world to have an impact on the most amount of people in a way that they're gonna make sense. And so I think one thing that I think about with that is that in the age of the internet, and like, you and I are doing a podcast episode right now that's going to
yeah,
be available online. The nice thing about the internet is that it's created this system of and this environment where, like, if I have a certain way of presenting my material and that makes sense for you, you can really latch onto
mhm,
that and you can really just like follow me on a journey of exploring whatever topic I want to cover. On the flip side, if it doesn't work for you, there's 20 other people doing the same thing that you can try out their style of teaching and engaging you with their content and see if that works for you.
yeah,
And translating that, specifically to my experience of working in education, that's not necessarily happening, in the sense of like you get assigned a teacher in school and then that's kind of it. Like if that teacher style of learning works really well for some people but doesn't work for you, you kind of get screwed, and that sucks. So like no one's really figured out how to address that, if that makes sense.
yeah, yeah, and that's part of what I would like to to see happen on a broader scope in the future. Because I understand it's difficult. Like I consider myself a pretty intelligent guy, but because of the way the school system is set up, I really didn't perform well. Um, and I did better more with like online courses in college, versus sitting in a classroom, um, and having to learn things that I wasn't interested in. Um, do you have anything like where you try to make things like topics more exciting for teachers, in that sense?
I think one approach that I have to that is just trying to like go beyond like what is the content and concept that I'm trying to teach and how do you actually apply it, in the sense of
Hmm.
like, okay, for example, I just sent out an email about boundaries, today, and like setting boundaries. And
Hmm.
so one of the things in there is like, when I'm thinking about crafting material for people, is like, okay, to some degree everybody knows that setting good boundaries is a good move, but why?
Yeah.
Or like, what does it look like? Like, how do you apply that? And so I like try to think beyond like just telling people like this is the content that you should know, and like how do I start to incorporate it into their lives in a way that makes sense. And this conversation happens a lot in the field of education, of like how do we make things more relevant and relatable. But I think
Yeah.
it's hard because we're stuck in the field of education. We're stuck in between like, a system of educational oversight, whether that be like the Department of Education or your school district setting the standards or whatever, and then the like generational differences between like one thing a lot of people say is like, "Oh, well, kids are different these days." Like, of course they're different these days, but like they're growing up in a completely different environment than everyone who's now expected to teach a classroom. Like even the like teachers on the younger side, teachers just getting into education, in their first couple of years now, different generation than I'm a part of, and they are still at a disadvantage from the kids that are sitting in their classroom because that generational gap is just becoming more and more like obvious, through the use of technology and just the introduction of like, if you want
Yeah.
to like use some stereotypes like the iPad babies, and stuff like that. But like, I think it's a good representation of like, yes, kids are changing. The way people are learning and consuming information is changing, and schools are having a really hard time catching up and bridging that gap because we have this like set of standards that we have to meet, and that's tied to funding and all these, all this other boring stuff. But like, how do you start to
Yeah.
bridge that gap in between these two things is really, really difficult. And I think like at the extreme ends, the people who like have a difficult time learning in those environments in the first place, specifically, in the context of ADHD, that the gap for being able to access that education is just becoming so much larger for them than it is for anybody else because, if you don't have ADHD, if you're, arguably stereotypically well adjusted or whatever, like you can maybe cobble
Yeah.
together something to like pretend like this makes sense and like pretend to get through it, but then like the second you throw something like ADHD in the mix, like your ability to like pretend or like bridge that gap between like this doesn't work for me but I have to do it anyways just becomes like so large that you can't possibly cross that gap. And I think that that's kind of like the disadvantage that we're setting our learners up for right now.
So you're basically dealing with the a technological um, generational gap, and then the ADHD gap kind of just makes it almost like an Indiana Jones type of leap of faith type thing. Like it's there, but it's so hard to see, and it's so hard to get to because I just feel um that there's not a whole lot of understanding still about ADHD on even in kids, even in children. um there are I've seen organizations and mandates that talk about education accommodations for people that are neurodivergent, um but like anything, it's probably needs a vast amount of improvement. Because what you're talking about in just the different types of learning, um, versus what's out there and what's available. That makes sense that there would be, there needs to be, um, more people in the mix. Especially that understand like ADHD, because I feel like in the ADHD research that I'm learning, it's more like we're just guinea pigs, and that's fine to a degree, but we need to be part of that, like that equation of learning, because like we see things differently. We see things that other people can't see. It's another perspective, and we're going through it. Like you can do all the brain scans that you want, and that's only going to tell you part of the equation. Like the feel, it's not going to show you where the feel, what the feelings feel like, what people go through, the intensity, um and how that plays out.
Yeah,
So I'm
absolutely.
curious, what's like your origin story? What got you involved in that?
That's a good question, and I will answer that, but I actually want to go back to something that you said because I think it's super super important, and it ties
Okay.
directly to my wife's experience. specifically around like the research on ADHD and just the general understanding, in the larger like community and society of what it means to have ADHD and what we can do to support people with ADHD and just learners of
Yeah.
all kinds. What she experienced was when she was talking with her doctor about this diagnosis and about like some options for medication and kind of like long-term impacts of some of these things. Her doctor was basically like, "Hey, like one thing you need to know is that most of this research comes from, research on boys and men. Like there's not a lot of like
Yeah.
quality
Yeah.
studies on the impacts on girls and women." And so, like for example, one of the questions that my wife asked her doctor was like, "What happens when I get pregnant? Like, how is this medicine going to impact the baby?" Like sometimes
Wow.
certain
Yeah.
medicines and things like you can take while pregnant, sometimes you can't. And the doctor was basically like, the research is just not there for me to be able to give you a good answer. And
Yeah.
that's scary. Like that's not okay, for
No, I
like a
definitely
like, it's
had the
insane.
similar feeling, like, when I got diagnosed and I'm going to see my therapist, and I'm asking him, like, what is this?" And he's like, kinda like, "We don't really know." It's like, I didn't know whether to call it ADD or ADHD, and the research that I did was just made me more confused. Like, I've literally had to dig deeper, and do my own thing, on things that are like not readily available. Um, there is a whole community, and I believe that a lot of the answers are out there. It's just so ADHD in its presentation because it's all over the place. It's You got to look here and there and here, and even when you gather all that, I still feel like there it's jaded. Like, it's not, you don't see the full picture. You don't have women involved, you don't have minorities involved, you don't have, educators involved, because, that personally hits hard for me is like I have one of my strengths that I recently found out is I love to learn. So, like, this whole education thing is like strikes like a certain chord with me because me understanding how hard it was to go to school and be around people not even knowing what was wrong, um and then add on top of that that I do have a disability when it comes to the quality of learning. Like, I needed to be kind of dumbed down or at least very synthesized, or I need to read it over and over and over again until I get it. And I used to think that I was slow, in a bad way when it came to stuff like that. But now I'm seeing it it's like, I feel like because we take in so much information that it's like one of those high resolution printers or I'm yeah, you get it. Like, it takes it a long time to print that image, but that image is so detailed. Like, that's kind of how the brain works. So now I don't see it as being slow. It just takes me more time to process things because I'm processing more,
Yeah,
if that
and
makes
that's
sense.
so absolutely. Yeah, it's like, okay, so I imagine, speaking from some of my own experience too, I don't know if this is kind of what it's like. For example, you said like you have to read something over and over and over again. Like I'm the kind of person
Mhm.
where if I have a page of stuff I need to read, I'll read it once and I'll be like, "Oh yeah, that one sentence made a lot of sense." And I'll just think
Yeah.
about that one sentence. And I'll go back and read it again and be like, "Holy crap, I didn't even see that second sentence." Like now I got to synthesize the two of those together and then read it a
Mhm.
third time and pick something else out and be like, How did I not notice this the first two times that I read it?" you know and so like
Because
there's
you yeah.
which is for me, I love watching movies, and I could watch the same movie and over and over and over again, like, just because,
Yeah.
like, every time it's, like, a new experience. Like, even though, like, my favorite one of my favorite movies is Across the Universe, and I've seen it so many times, but every time I get
Yeah.
something new from it, you know?
Yeah,
The
yeah.
same.
It's like they did that this one study on suspenseful movies, and like, is it as suspenseful the second time even though you know what's going to happen, and the answer is like typically yes, because it's just like you're still going through it. You're still experiencing it and it's still scary. You know what's going to happen, but or if like at the end of the episode Batman's going to survive, but you're like, but how is he going to do it?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah, and it's still
like
exciting.
yeah. You're like, well, I know he's going to survive because I've seen him in these movies. Like,
Yeah.
and this is definitely past that point. I mean, that movie's past the point that I'm watching now. It's still interesting to see how like the writers or how the main character comes out. But yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely, and so then I think that kind of to bring us back together with what we were talking about,
Yeah.
my origin story kinda ties in nicely with something I'm thinking about, of what you said of kind of like, okay, like, we have this information of like, "Oh, yeah, it's ADHD," like, good luck with that. Or like, "Well, what does that mean? What
There
do I
you
do
go.
with this information? Like, how do I do something with this? Like, what can I change, or how do I understand this?" They're like, "I don't know."
Yeah.
Like, what happened for me was, so I've been an educator for the last 10 years and working in schools, and I was super, super excited to start working in schools, and I got, like, basically, at the time when I was 21, it was, like, my dream job. I was like, "Finally, I'm gonna be, like, a teacher's
Mhm.
assistant working in a school. This is so
Yeah.
exciting."
Yeah.
And it was, like, the greatest thing that had ever happened to me, and just, like, there's this like mindset when you like want to work in education, and when you do work in education, that like this is like your life's calling, basically, or like I can't imagine myself doing anything else, like this is like,
Mhm.
the thing. But then, like, after 4 years I ended up burning out really, really hard. Really, like, 3 years in I burnt out, and then that 4th year was like just existing with burnout. And it got so bad that I ended up quitting that job. I, like, quit my dream job because I just, like, couldn't handle it, or I wasn't good enough, or I didn't know what it was at the time. And then
So
I go ahead.
like, do you know what burns you out? Like, what was causing all that stress?
At the time, no, because I was like, "What the heck? Like, this is the coolest job I've ever had." Like, I feel so
It's
connected to this
yeah.
job. Like, I don't know why I'm burning out. Like, what like, why am I going home,
Hmm.
like, with 0 energy, 0 ability to, like, do anything after work, and then, like, waking up in the morning and having to expend most of my energy for the day just getting out of bed so I can get to work on time. Like,
Yeah.
it didn't make any sense to me, and it took me, after I quit that job, I got another job, uh, in security in another school, and so then I was like, okay, like, the first school that I was in was pretty intense. I was working in a school for kids with social and emotional disabilities. So, like, it was
Okay.
like, heightened emotions and intensity, like, always.
Yeah.
But I really liked that environment. So I was like, okay, like, maybe that's part of it. Maybe it's just because it's so intense, like, there's so much happening. I'll get a job where I have a little bit less responsibility, like, less intensity. Like, went to a neighborhood high school where things were objectively more chill, like, just across the
Mhm.
board. And
Yeah.
still, I was like, what the heck? Like, I again am doing a job that I feel really passionately about, and I still don't know, like, how to, like, keep going with this. Like, I feel still burnt out, like, quitting my job and taking less responsibility, kind of chilling out a little bit, having a more low-key environment, that's still not
Mhm.
helping. Like, what is this? I didn't figure it out for another couple of years. Like, it took me about 3 years to figure it out when I eventually quit that job too, and accepted
Okay.
another job that I was so excited about this job, more so than I had been for any other job. And this job was case
Yeah.
managing students who were expelled in our district. And our school district is massive, which is why it was its own job. So anywhere between like 80 to 150 kids would need like case management services from me
Mhm.
during the year. And not necessarily just because they were expelled, but either expelled or at risk of being expelled, involved in some kind of
Yeah,
like district level.
me
Yeah.
over here.
Yeah. So, and
I
I
remember
was
this.
I was lucky enough to just not get caught with any of my shenanigans when I was in high school, but, I really related
Yeah,
to these students that I was working
yeah,
with,
yeah.
and I was like, "Man, I am more excited than I've ever been about this job, but I still can't, like, shake this burnout thing. Like, what is going on? Like, why do I feel like every day is just a struggle? I can't catch up." And over time, what kinda started to make the difference was I was like, self-care, I'm, like, starting to do all the things right. Like, I'm starting to exercise and, like, take a better look at my diet, try to get more sleep, be more intentional with my screen time, and, like, spend time with the relationships outside of work that I care about, but, like, I still don't understand why I'm, like, feeling this way. And kind of what it came down to for me was that I had started to learn and just exist in this way of showing up to work and just taking whatever it was that came at me, taking it at face value, and then just getting it done, just doing the work. I didn't really have
Mhm.
like a set plan of how I was going to actually like organize my work, or how I was going to respond to things when they came in, or how I would go about like managing a number of responsibilities and projects, or how I would go about like actually spending the time that I had to work independently. Like, that was just like I didn't know how to do that. And for a while, like, that worked because I didn't necessarily have to think a month in advance or 6 months in advance. But as it got to
Yeah.
the point in my career where I was now case managing students who I had to come up with like 1 to 2 years of a plan in advance, and not necessarily
Mm.
like something that was solid and wouldn't change, but like I had to start thinking ahead. And I realized that
Yeah.
I was just so focused on thinking about things like in the moment as they came up, but I didn't have this, I'd never developed the skills to like have this forward thinking. And that required a lot of like work and experimentation on my part to figure out, how do I manage a workload? Like, that was just
Yeah.
like nothing that I had ever been taught or learned how to do. Like, how do I, in its simplest form, show up to work and do my job? Like, I just didn't know.
Yeah.
And it was like one of these things of like, okay, like when I was in high school, like whatever, you show up, and I was the kind of kid that like I could show up for just the test and be fine. Like, then college, the same thing kind of happened. It was like, okay, everybody else was making the structure for me, so I could just like show up in the room and they'd be like, do this now, but and I would do it and that'd be fine. But then as I started to get more responsibility to kind of define my own work and how I wanted to engage with it, I was like, I don't know how to do this. So I started
Yeah.
like researching like, how do you like, basically I started going down the productivity and rabbit hole of like, how do you like be more productive? How do you like organize your work? How do you like organize your calendar? How do you like set up a page in your notebook so that like you can actually like write things down? And through a lot of trial and error, I started to learn like, oh, I was experiencing burnout not because of the intensity of the work that I was doing. That certainly played a factor.
So when we come back, we'll find out how Jake Ruzi was able to overcome that burnout. Yeah.
But most of my burnout was coming from the fact that I was just like throwing myself into absolute chaos without a plan of how I was going to address it.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
what I started to
Into the
learn was
wolves.
like, yeah, I was just essentially throwing myself into the wolves every single day, and not really doing anything to like armor myself up or figure out how to protect myself in those situations, like, kind of more metaphorically. But like I just like didn't know how to organize my work in a way that made sense. And then because of that, like my quality of work was really suffering. Like, yeah, I was like getting praised for like the things I was doing, but at the same time, like it didn't feel like it was good enough. It didn't feel like I was doing the work that I could do. And so when I started to apply those, I started finding myself like being able to produce better quality work than I had before with a lot less effort and like a lot less stress. And then
Mhm.
like going home on time or close to on time was like became a lot easier. And the way in which I would like work and organize my stuff and be able to have that forward thinking of like a year or two out was just so much easier, to the point where like I ended up being on a team of people who opened up a new school. And you can't open a new school unless you have a clear plan and you have a clear system of organization for how
Yeah,
you like
wow.
want to go about that. And like granted, I was just on the team. I wasn't the person like driving all of this, but you know, you kind of get to see like, wow, like we're planning things like 5, 10 years out for how the school's going to work and what this is going to look like. But I'm so used to just showing up and doing things like as they come up in the moment. Like I wasn't even thinking 5 minutes ahead, you know. But so like as these opportunities started to present themselves and my work started to become more complex, like I had to really simplify my like productivity system and how that worked. So
Yeah.
then kind of now
We had to
leading
have
to
a
where we are
plan.
now. Yeah, leading to where we are now, like it's like, okay, what I learned along the way is that just because people are like, oh man, time blocking is the thing that you need to be doing. Like if you're not time blocking, you're not productive at all. I was like, that's crap. That doesn't work for me. Like I'm going to figure out
Okay.
how to put together my own system of productivity that does work for me, and then start to like give myself permission to like ignore all the productivity bros that are like, "Oh, if you're not doing this, like then you're not being productive." Like, no, that doesn't work for me. So now my kind of approach is like, here's kind of your menu of options for how you can start to organize your work. And like, here's the things that work for me really well, but that doesn't mean they have to work for you. So, like, how do you start to engage in the process of figuring out what works for you and what doesn't? And so tying that back into like kind of
Mhm.
the ADHD experience of like, well, you have ADHD, but like what does that mean? What do I do with that? Like I'm really fascinated with like how do you go about like determining what works for you and what doesn't work for you, because there's just so much noise with the internet and just like, you know, whatever that looks like for you as far
Yeah,
as
yeah,
like
I definitely, like, there are so many options out there, and that's where it gets, like, a little haywire, because I'm like, "Well, I can try this, and I can try that, and I try that," but then I end up not trying anything because it's too many. It's decision fatigue. So, for you, what would you recommend are some good ways to, like, organize, like, that have, particularly helped you in organization?
so I think one thing that's kind of worked for me that I like work with people to try to figure out is like what are some basic principles that you can get behind that like align with your values and like the ways that you know you are kind of already
Mhm.
exist. And then how do these like different tools start to fit in those principles and those values? So for example, like one of the people that I'm super inspired by is Cal Newport, and he's wrote a couple of books
Okay.
about like productivity and like how to organize your work in a way that makes more sense, specifically for
Hmm.
knowledge workers. And that's kind of the sector that he has kind of defined himself as being a part of, is this knowledge worker
Yeah.
section where like sometimes your work isn't necessarily tangible. Like for example, if you are working in schools, like the measure for being productive isn't necessarily like I had X number of conversations and therefore I am productive, or like X number of conversations with my students and therefore I am productive. Like your productivity
Mhm.
as a teacher or as a school leader is like measured in like years and like like subjective experience for students. So like how do you measure that on
Yeah.
a productivity scale? And so he compares this to like when factories were first, the industrial revolution, and Henry Ford opened his first uh Ford Motor Factory. Like the
Okay.
measure of productivity is how many cars can we produce? And we
Yeah.
have these different levers that we can pull on, and these different like ways that we can have our production line meet that goal of like, if we're producing more cars, then I know we're more productive. But that doesn't work for people in knowledge work sectors, is kind of the argument that he lays out. And so I think like one principle that I've really taken away from him is that you can do higher quality work when you work on less things at once. Because
Yeah.
juggling a million different things, you're just going to do a million different things really poorly, and none of them are going to be really good. But so how do you learn to
Yeah.
focus on less things at once? And so then taking that principle and then applying it to the way in which you can make that work for you. For me, I have like a here I could show you.
Yeah. Sure.
This is my like paper This is my paper box of all of my
So
projects that I
yeah,
want to get to. And so I
it's
think
like a
one thing
clear
that's
bin.
yeah, and so you can, I don't know, obviously if you're listening to the podcast, you can't necessarily see this, but it's all labeled with all the projects that I want to get to, and each project
Hmm.
has its own folder. And whenever I have an idea for like, ooh, I want to work on that, it can go through a
Put it
couple of
in. You
different
put it in
steps.
there.
Yeah, I
Oh,
put it
okay.
in a bin where I don't have to think about it now until I'm ready to focus on it. And then I have a list
Mm.
of projects that I am actively working on, knowing that if that list that of actively working on projects gets way too big, then all of them are going to start to suffer.
Yeah. So you can only put a certain amount in the active bin,
hmm Yeah, and of course
and
it's
then
like,
but you can have as many as you want in the other bins.
yeah, so then when I get the to the point of like, all right, I've finished this project, um
Hmm.
like for example, in my work, if I'm like working really hard on developing a training or putting together a proposal for a school that wants to work with me, like that is in the project bin, and everything I think about starts to revolve around that. And then all the stuff that I start to do revolves around that. And then when that's done, that project now moves to my archives. And then I can now look through and be like, ooh, what do I want to work on next? Sometimes I don't necessarily have to think because I know what I want to work on next, but I'll pull out that folder and
Yeah.
put it in, my active projects, and then get to start working on that. And I try to keep it to like 3 to 4 projects at once, just because you can't work on just one thing at a time, like realistically.
Yeah.
Like you know, f- if you have a job where you don't work for yourself, like you kind of have to like exist within the bounds of like, here's the expectations of the jobs. But at the same
Hmm.
time, like with my experience working in schools, there is some leeway in trying to figure out how do you build a better culture within your job and within your role of being really open and honest with how do you do your best work. And so for me, that was like having very clear conversations with my principal of like, hey, you're asking me to do this, but here's the other things that I'm also doing. Like, where's the wiggle room? Like, I can't
Hmm.
do all of this at once. Do you want me to focus on this now or in 2 weeks when I have better ability when this project's done? Or do you want me to put something on hold so I can just really focus on this, and like really making it about
So you
I
have
can
the conversations.
yeah. Yeah, and really making that conversation about how I can produce my best quality work, because that's what people want, and people like to hear that. Like if you
Yeah.
have a boss, they want to hear how you're going to be able to do your highest quality work. So being really open and transparent with how you can do that in a realistic way, like sometimes things just need to get done, and maybe you have to juggle 5 projects instead of your preferred 3. Like it happens, but that's kind of been like the principle one of the principles of like, if I can
So
work
like
on
kind of
less at
speaking
once.
their speaking
Yeah.
their language and being like, Well, as a boss, what would I like to hear um, if somebody had an excuse of not
Mhm.
doing the work? Um, and that would be like, well, do you want the best? Well, this is kind of how it has to play out within for me to do it. Somebody
Yeah.
else might be able to do that differently. So it's kind of just like finding your way of organizing the projects and whatever you want to do in your life in
Yeah.
a way that you can be the best at doing it. Yeah, I feel like that way too for me is like, making a podcast and building a website, especially for ADHD is like two huge projects and plus I'm working full time, so it's like and then I see something else and I'm like, yeah, not right now. Cuz it like yeah, like I was telling my therapist it was like the last episode was about fear of missing out. So I'm reading like 3 books or 4 books at once and I need to absorb that, do all these things and like and understand what ADHD really is in like 2 months. Um and it doesn't work that way. It's just and I've had to get burnt out from doing that. And I don't want to get burnt out because I'm passionate about this. Like like you were saying, like I'm putting too much on my plate without a plan.
Mhm.
Pretty much, right?
Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with having multiple things that you're focused on or multiple things that are important, but the problem comes when you get to the point where you're like, "Okay, I'm gonna spend 5 minutes on this, and then I'm gonna switch over, spend 10 minutes on this," and
Yeah.
then like, "Okay, I got a spare 5 minutes now, I can work on this," and then and then you look back and you're like, "Wow, like because I only spent like 5, 10, 20 minutes on this thing in small increments, like I wasn't actually able to
Yeah.
like get into the mindset of doing complex work requires you to have like a complex like frame of mind. And you just can't get to that in a short period of time. And it's like some of the research points to that like when we switch tasks, it can take up to like 15, 20 minutes for our brain to fully get
Oh yeah,
engrossed
yeah.
in whatever it is we're
Like it's
working on.
called
So if
yeah, it's called like switching costs.
yeah,
So it's
exactly.
how much it's going to take you like to like your brain a certain amount of time. Like before this interview, I'm like, well, I've got like 5 minutes to send out an email. And I'm like, no, you don't even know how to how to set this script up and you want to go do this when you should be focusing on I'm like I have to shut it down all the time. Because my brain it works. It's like I see a task and I have the time and where I think I got the time and I need to do it. But usually it's like I don't take into account that switching cost, which is like that's why none of us are good at multitasking. It's usually like only one task, especially with ADHD. Like we have enough trouble focusing on one thing. Period.
Mhm.
Like, especially if it's dealing with the computer and like I go to another screen and I want to, search something on Google and then whatever Google has set up for me to to bait me, I'm always at risk. But I've got to tell myself like, look, that's not what we're doing right now. You can do that at another time, but right now, and my brain's still like, well, what if it's important? Like that looked interesting.
Yeah, and so I have a strategy that I use because I have that same kind
Okay.
of like, oh, everything is super shiny and super awesome, and I should just go to all the shiny things. Like, so
Yeah.
I keep a pack of Post-it notes on my desk, and anytime
Hmm.
I like, because typically there's this like
Oh yeah.
subconscious like I know what I should be working on. I know what I need to be spending my time on right now. but
Yeah,
this other
that
thing
voice is
seems
so
really cool.
small.
Yeah, and it gets drowned out by like, "But look at this cool thing." So what I do is I write that
Yeah.
cool thing on a Post-it note, whether that's like an idea that I have or whether that's a to-do list thing. I just write it on a Post-it note and then I stick it in a bucket that I have. And I just went through it, so I just had a mound of Post-it notes that have just like
I don't know if I
ideas
could do that
and
though.
things. Yeah, just like things that I was like, whatever, basically whatever was distracting me that I was like, that's a good enough idea to write down. And for me,
Yeah.
what that kinda does is, like, I'm like, "Okay, I've captured this thing, I've gotten it out of my head, and I know that I can come back to it." So, like, subconsciously, I'm kind of like, "It's taken care of." Like, if it's a really good idea, I can come back to it later. But then now I can just get back to trying to focus on, what it is I'm
Yeah,
trying to
yeah.
work
Well,
on.
that gives you the permission, like, "Okay, we'll check it out later. It's
Yeah.
in the bucket."
I know, and
But,
I've found
not
personally
right
the
now.
yeah, not right now, please. But I've found personally, like, the first, like, 15 minutes of trying to, like, get started on a task, like, coming back to it takes, like, 15 minutes to switch to a task, like, for me, the first 15 minutes is when I have the most ideas of how I could distract myself from what I'm trying to work on, and if I can, like, handle that for the first 15 minutes of like trying to work on, like crafting a nice email to send out or something like that, or, working
Mhm.
on a proposal for a school or crafting a training or making a YouTube video. Like if I can just kind of dump those distractions out of my brain for the first 15 minutes, then after that it gets significantly easier to like one not have a million ideas that I think are really cool, but two like actually focus on the thing that I'm trying to get to. So for me, like I find myself writing a
Yeah.
lot of post-it notes in the first couple minutes of trying to focus on something, and
Mm.
then it I stop getting kind of sidetracked by like my own brain.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I typically just give myself, like, 5, 10, 15 minutes to just go through whatever. I'm usually pretty good about it because I'm like, I want to get this stuff done. Like I'm passionate about it. But I can imagine if somebody's not, if they have to do something they're not passionate about, like what I've been doing lately is when I go to work, like I don't see my job as like the actual job that I have, like that they're paying me for. I see my job as just being someone that's compassionate and understanding. Like they can come to me and talk about, what they're stressed about. I'm going to listen. I'm not necessarily going to give you any suggestions or advice on how to fix that. I'm just going to listen, maybe talk about what works with me, and it's going to stay with me. And, I feel like that's needed at the job, period. That should be a position that you can come to and say, look, I feel this way about the job. And it's not going to go anywhere. It's going to stay right there. Like people need to have that, like that open door. That's not their boss because it's just, we all struggle at some point and we just need somebody to hear us. So with the, back to your girlfriend getting ADHD, what do you know, like what prompted that?
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting. We've talked about this of like why now? Like why are we, I say we, but it's her, but like why
Yeah, yeah. Well,
w-
you're going through it together, and
yeah,
that's a good
like
thing.
why now as far as like going and being like I'm in a cuz she like went to her doctor and was like, "Hey, like I kind of think I might have ADHD. Like, what does that look like?" And got some information and then came prepared of like, here's all the things I noticed. And we were kind of reflecting on like, why now? Like she's 31. Like why, why now and
Yeah,
not 10 years ago? Because, one of the things is that like, it's, if you have it now, you've had it your entire life. Like, it's not like this has gone
yeah.
away.
Well, it's kind of like I know I have it, but I don't want to like know that I have it. It's scary knowing. Maybe.
Yeah. And for her, it was, she said, just like, it's like, do I need the diagnosis? Like, no, but like, what is that gonna do for me? And what it's going to do for me is like kind of validate a lot of what I've been experiencing my whole life and be able to point
Hmm.
to it and be like, that's why that happened. And not necessarily in the sense of like, oh, like that's why that happened, woe is me, but like that's why that happened. Now I have an understanding and it doesn't have to bother me so that I can start
Yeah,
to like move on with my life.
it
You know,
starts to
and
make
figure out
sense.
like, okay, like, now I don't have to stress about, like, why was it so hard for me to get stuff done in college? Or, like, why was it so hard for me
Yeah,
to, like, just sit down and kind of do these tasks that, like, even just as something as simple as, like, getting started on house chores. Like, no one
yeah,
wants to do house chores, but, like, for some people, getting started on them is just, like, such myself included, is, like, such a huge barrier of, like, there's a million other things I'd like to be working on, but, like, at the end of the day, I gotta
yeah,
have clean clothes, like, or at the end of the day, I gotta have a wash my dishes, you know? But, like, for her, it was,
yeah,
that validation of like that's why it's hard. Now I can start to figure out how to overcome it. And I think when we were like answering the question of like why now, it kind of comes down to like for the longest time, like she was also an educator too, and we met while she was a teacher, and like during those times, like it was really similar to my experience of like just like, man, this is too much. Like how does a person like have a job like this and like still exist as a
I know
regular
that
human
must
being
be
outside of this?
that's that's very resilient. Like I can't imagine like putting together a curriculum for students and dealing with them and then having that's more power to her, for doing
Yeah.
that without any help. That's amazing. That's what I'm
Yeah.
saying.
And
Like we're amazingly resilient people that just to survive in this world that's not built for us. Um,
absolutely.
and to have other people that kind of get it that don't really have it, but like understand like that there's a different way of learning. So
Yeah, and then, what ended up happening is that she ended up leaving. She went back to school to become a social worker,
mhm,
and when she was finished with all that, she got a job as a school-based therapist working for. So she got a job with our community mental health organization that then assigned her to a school. So she didn't work for the school. The expectations and the culture were so vastly different than what she was used to working in schools, where she like now had the permission to like basically breathe and take a break, and like
wow,
was expected to take care of herself, and like kind of a similar to like my experience of like, holy crap,
that's
like,
awesome. That's
yeah,
awesome.
like this is what it's like to like take a breath, and like this is what it's like to
Yeah,
like be in a
I
place where
know.
the expectation is like, like you can take a day off without, everything falling apart,
Mental
or
health
people,
days.
yeah, or just
Yeah,
even like for example, her mental, or like the organization that she works for, they have, every employee has 1 hour of wellness time every week, and every week you have 1 hour
wow,
out of your 40 hours that you
that's
are paid to just spend however you want. And like that's
that's
just like
awesome.
built into the culture of this organization of like, if you don't take care of yourself, you're not going to be able to take care of others. Seems obvious, right?
Yeah,
But what she experienced was like, oh, holy crap, like this is incredible. And I'm still
that's
feeling
awesome.
like everything is really hard. Like, what is this? And so then that's when she was like, when she was able to actually like take a step back and be like, oh, like now I'm putting the pieces of the puzzle together of like why these things are hard. And I think it might be pointing to ADHD, but for her, like because she had never had that space to like think and like be allowed to like think more critically about her experience, because everything was just go, 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 go all the time. Like once she had a
Yeah,
moment to like step back and observe and be like, this doesn't feel right. Like this doesn't seem like this is like what everybody else is experiencing, everybody else being, kind of general. But and then she was
yeah,
in a
yeah.
conversation with one of her colleagues, and one of her colleagues, she was just talking about her work experience and kind of like how things were going with the new job and all this stuff. And one of her colleagues, also a therapist, was like, have you ever been diagnosed with ADHD? And that kind of just, just like sent it off of like, when she started doing
That
the
was it.
research and like started talking to her doctor, she was like, oh, like, why did it take me
Yeah.
30 plus
Well,
years to like figure this out? And
I mean,
here
she's
we are.
still relatively young. I've got mine, a couple years ago, so she's way ahead of the game, especially being a woman. So,
Hmm.
we're about to be, about to have to wrap this up. But one final question: who's your favorite Star Wars character?
Ooh, favorite Star Wars character. My favorite. Oh, that's a tough one because like I have a lot of like I just really like the style of Darth Vader, but I also
Hmm.
feel like that's a very stale and boring answer because but I also think
Hey,
that like when I look back at like what's the like character arcs that I'm most excited about, it's probably Ahsoka Tano
yeah,
because like
yeah,
just
she's a good one.
yeah, so I really like and and because the two are connected, that's super fun too, but
I
yeah,
know.
probably
Like she's
Darth between Darth Vader and Ahsoka.
Yeah. My personal favorite is Han Solo. I just love that guy. I honestly just don't really like the Jedi. They're kind of boring, and you know, um, I just like their lightsabers. I mean, there
Yeah.
are some cool Jedi's. Like Obi-Wan's pretty badass, and Mace Windu, but like Han Solo is just, I don't know, there's something about him.
Yeah, just some
Plus,
dude
it's
with a
like
blaster
Ron
saving the
Solo.
universe.
Yeah. Plus, it's like Ron Solo. It's like my
Oh, there you
cousin.
go. Perfect.
All
Yeah,
right.
well,
Well, it was a pleasure. I thank you again, man. It's an honor and a pleasure to have you on the show. And thank you. It was a great conversation.
yeah, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you, Jake. That was an amazing session. I hope that you guys got as much out of it as I did. So here's the part where you've been waiting for, the part where you get your free stuff. So I've developed a document that's called My 5 Hacks for Overcoming Fear and Anxiety. And you can get that at www.advocate.xyz/fear. And that's with 2 D's. So it's 80 ADDVOCATE.xyz/fear. And as always, please send me any comments, suggestions, if anything's working for you, any reviews, and anything you might want to hear about. And you can send me a quick 60-second audio clip to my email, which is Ron Sowers at DADHDWSS.com. And that's RONSOUERS at DADHDWSS.com. And as always, thank you for listening, and please subscribe.